The Young and the Restless spoilers. The diner buzzed with the usual hum of activity, waiters moving between tables, customers chatting over their meals. But the tension at the corner booth was palpable. Diane Jenkins sat across from her son, Kyle Abbott, her eyes cold and calculating. Kyle, normally composed, was visibly tense. The confrontation that had been brewing between mother and son had finally come to a head. "You think you can get away with it, don't you?" Diane's voice was sharp, her words laced with disdain. She leaned in, her gaze piercing Kyle's. "You're nothing but a thief. You stole from your own family, from Jabot. How could you?" Kyle's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had long respected his mother, despite her flaws. He had always tried to see the best in her, even when others couldn't. But now, as Diane hurled accusations and insults at him, it was becoming harder to hold his tongue. Diane's patience had worn thin. Her son's betrayal, taking the formula from Jabot and using it for glissade, was unforgivable in her eyes. She felt personally affronted, as if Kyle's actions were a reflection of her failure as a mother. And Diane wasn't someone who handled failure well. "You're going to pay for what you've done," she spat. "I'll make sure you go to prison for this, Kyle. I swear it." Kyle's hands clenched into fists under the table, but he still didn't respond. He wasn't about to lash out at his mother, no matter how harsh her words were. He had made mistakes, but he wasn't the only one. Diane wasn't innocent in this, far from it. She had played her part in creating the man he had become, yet here she was, blaming him for everything. Kyle's silence only fueled Diane's anger. "I'm done with you," she said, her voice lowering to a venomous whisper. "You're not my son anymore. You're just a criminal, and you deserve to rot for what you've done." Before Kyle could respond, a new voice broke through the tension. Jack Abbott, Kyle's father, had entered the diner and heard enough to set his own blood boiling. Jack had witnessed many arguments in his lifetime, but this one was different. The venom in Diane's voice, the disgust she directed at Kyle, it was too much for Jack to stand by and tolerate. "Diane, that's enough," Jack said, his voice firm, but barely hiding the anger boiling beneath the surface. He stepped forward, standing between his ex-wife and his son, his protective instincts fully awakened. Diane looked up at Jack, her expression twisting in anger. "Don't you dare take his side, Jack. You know what he did. He's a thief." Jack's gaze shifted between Diane and Kyle. His son looked down, visibly distressed, his respect for his mother preventing him from speaking out. But Jack was not bound by the same restraint. Years of pent-up frustration finally came flooding out, and he wasn't gonna— Diane recoiled, her eyes wide with shock. Jack's words hit her harder than any insult she had thrown at Kyle. She had always prided herself on being the victim, the misunderstood one. But now Jack was turning the tables on her. "Don't you dare," Diane hissed, her voice trembling with anger. "I did what I had to do for my son. I tried to protect him. You have no idea." "No," Jack interrupted, his voice shaking with fury. "You don't get to rewrite history, Diane. You left him when he needed you most. You only came back when it suited you. And now you're trying to destroy him because things didn't go your way?" Diane stood up, her face flushed with rage. "You're out of line, Jack. I did everything I could for Kyle. Everything. And now you're blaming me for his choices?" Jack's anger reached its breaking point. In a split second, his hand flew up, striking Diane across the face with a sharp slap. The sound echoed through the diner, and everything went silent. The customers, the waitstaff, everyone turned to witness the shocking scene unfold. Diane stumbled back, her hand flying to her cheek, eyes wide with disbelief. For a moment she couldn't speak, the impact of what had just happened sinking in. Jack, equally shocked by his own actions, stood frozen in place, his hand still hanging in the air. Jack stammered, guilt immediately flooding his face. "I didn't mean." But it was too late, the damage was done. Diane straightened herself, her face a mask of hurt and fury. She looked at Jack with a mixture of betrayal and disbelief. "How dare you," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with venom. "How dare you put your hands on me?" Jack opened his mouth to apologize, but Diane didn't wait for an explanation. She turned on her heel and stormed out of the diner, her head held high, but tears already welling in her eyes. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Jack, the man she had once loved, had struck her in front of their son. And worse, He had told her that she wasn't a good mother, that she was the reason for Kyle's downfall. It was too much for her to bear. As Diane disappeared through the diner's doors, Jack stood in stunned silence. He couldn't believe what he had done. He felt a surge of guilt rise up in his chest, but it was too late to take it back. The slap, the harsh words, he had crossed a line he never thought he would. Kyle remained seated, his eyes downcast. He hadn't moved since the confrontation began, too overwhelmed to intervene. Now, as the dust settled, he felt the crushing weight of guilt settle over him. This was his fault. If he hadn't made those mistakes, if he hadn't stolen the formula, none of this would have happened. His mother wouldn't have been humiliated, and his father wouldn't have lashed out. "I'm sorry," Kyle muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack, still reeling from what had just happened, turned to his son. "It's not your fault."